So, good morning. I'm Nicholas de Mattos. I'm a tutor and a student in the School of Philosophy and Economic Science. I'm going to talk to you this morning about Diogenes, part 2. Diogenes of Sinope. So here he is. So in part 1, I told you that Diogenes had been brought up in a prosperous household in Sinope on the Black Sea, a coastal town. That was until he and his father, who was an official in charge of the town's finances, were convicted of tampering with the coinage and expelled. Told by the oracle to revalue the currency, Diogenes took this to indicate that he should direct citizens' priorities away from commercialism and short-term gain and encourage simple living and contemplation. He led by example, famously living in a barrel. At the end of part 1, we left Diogenes living alone in a Corinthian grove, having been captured by pirates, sold as a slave, bought as a tutor to 2 boys, and freed eventually by his grateful master. Though Diogenes survived on the bare minimum and for the most part lived alone, he was not a hermit. He believed, like Socrates, that he was on earth to teach man and follow the bidding of the oracle. Consequently, he traveled a great deal. At one time, ending up in the court of Dionysius I of Syracuse, a notorious tyrant, which was probably why Diogenes went there. Plato had preceded him there and had a difficult time with the tyrant, ending up in prison. Perhaps this was the reason why Diogenes was never admitted to the court. However, one of the courtiers was Aristippus of Cyrene, a proponent of hedonism, the belief that pleasure was the ultimate good. This clearly appealed to Dionysius, and Aristippus remained a firm favorite. Aristippus was out and about in the city of Syracuse one day when he came across Diogenes cooking lentils. By then, Diogenes' reputation was preceding him wherever he went, so Aristippus was intrigued to meet him. Diogenes was less enthusiastic to meet Aristippus. The two quickly agreed to differ in their outlooks. However, on taking leave of Diogenes, Aristippus said to him, "You know, if you flattered Dionysius a little more, you would not have to eat lentils." Diogenes looked at him one last time and said, "If you ate lentils, you would not have to flatter Dionysius." Returning to Greece, Diogenes somehow became involved in the Battle of Chaeronea between the forces of Athens and those of Philip of Macedon. And this is one of those strange reconstructions from a skull. And the reason why they thought the skull was Philip's was because there was an account of him receiving a sword slash in his face, which blinded him in the right eye. And so on that basis, the skull showed this damage, and his face was reconstructed on this basis. So you never know, there was the face of Philip of Macedon. Perhaps, like Socrates, Diogenes volunteered as a soldier, but more likely he was a camp follower, one who followed the army and made himself useful as a servant to the soldiers who paid and fed him. If the latter, Diogenes would probably have been there principally to teach. At any rate, he was taken prisoner and transported to Macedon, where he amused Philip so much that the king freed him, and he remained for some time at liberty in the palace and got to know the young Alexander, later the Great. In July 336, when Diogenes was 64, he turned up at the 111th Olympic Games. He was asked by the officials if he'd come to watch the competitions, but he answered that he'd come to compete, to combat the human ills of anger, mistrust, sadness, desire, and fear. Apparently, at one point, an announcement proclaimed that an athlete called Dioxippus had defeated all his opponents. Diogenes stood up and said, "Nonsense! Dioxippus has only defeated slaves where I have defeated men." Back in Corinth, some years later, when Alexander the Great was proclaimed commander of an expedition against Persia from there, Diogenes refused to go to the port to acknowledge him. Alexander, knowing that Diogenes lived in the city, personally sought him out. Plutarch takes over the narrative. At the approach of so many people, Diogenes sat up a little and fixed his eyes on Alexander. When the king greeted him and asked him if there was anything he wanted, Diogenes replied, "Yes, that you should stand a little out of my sun." It's said that Alexander was so impressed by this and by the arrogance and grandeur of spirit of a man who could treat him with such disdain that he said to his courtiers, who were laughing and joking about the philosopher as they walked away, "But I'll tell you this, if I were not Alexander, I would be Diogenes." Alexander, as intrigued by Diogenes as his father had been, invited him to the palace at Macedon, where there was a family mausoleum in which Philip II had been buried years before. At one point, Alexander, looking for him, found him with a lantern in the tomb and asked him what he was doing. "I'm trying to find the bones of your father, but I cannot distinguish them from those of his slaves." A lesson in humility, perhaps. Diogenes, having returned to Corinth, lived to a great old age. When he became ill, reputedly from eating raw octopus to show the needlessness of cooking, he gave instructions to his followers that his body be thrown away somewhere outside the city. His followers, horrified, asked in amazement if he wanted his body to feed the animals and birds. "No," replied Diogenes, "if you provide me with a stick." "But you'll be dead," they said. "So why should I care then?" he replied. When the time came, however, after much heated argument amongst his followers, the citizens gave him a proper funeral and a tombed burial outside the walls of Corinth. Amongst them were the sons of Xeniades, who as boys had been taught by the philosopher. A bronze statue of Diogenes was erected after his death at Sinope. He had indeed achieved a renown that overshadowed his previous disgrace. Beneath the statue was this inscription: "Even bronze is aged by time, but not all the ages, Diogenes, will destroy your fame, since you alone showed mortals the rule of self-sufficiency and the easiest path through life." As it seems with all wise men, Diogenes of Sinope was often quoted. He's often pictured with a dog or surrounded by them. And it seems in keeping with his vagabond-type character that he would have had one or another as a constant companion. Two quotes are about dogs. "Dogs and philosophers do the greatest good and get the fewest rewards," he said. On another occasion, he said, "I am Diogenes the dog. I nuzzle the kind, bark at the greedy, and bite scoundrels." But the quote I'd like to leave you with is in an answer he gave to a crowd in Athens. Naturally, for an extrovert, Diogenes would do things in public to evoke a response. Hence, living in a barrel and wandering through the streets with a lantern in broad daylight, saying he was looking for a man. On one particular occasion, he spent some time in the Stoa, the colonnade around the marketplace in Athens, walking backwards. A crowd soon collected, and when the laughing and the catcalls had reached their peak, he stopped and waited for the noise to die down. "Aren't you ashamed," he said, "you who walk backwards along the whole path of existence, and blame me for walking backwards along a colonnade?" It's useful to imagine how he might have explained this to the Athenian crowd. We are at this juncture in time in a bit of a pickle. In spite of breathtaking advances in technology over the last 150 years, humanity is still in the midst of wars, principally over land and ideology. There are still instances in these modern times of ethnic cleansing. As late as the 1990s, there was the Rwandan genocide and Srebrenica in Bosnia, where 8,000 men and boys were massacred on the orders of the Serb leader Slobodan Milosevic. From the days when the British Civil Service ran an empire, whatever you may think of that concept, we've indeed walked backwards into a time when a civil service department cannot even handle affairs in our own country. So what's the answer to this problem? I believe the answer lies in a return to principle, to philosophy and simple traditional religion, and to education. With regard to religion, Diogenes said, "I do not know whether there are gods, but there ought to be." With regard to education, he said, "The foundation of every state is the education of its youth." Now, as a classicist, I'm going to sound a little biased, but maybe we should return to the study of classics and the liberal arts, follow Plato's lead with his music and gymnastics. A return to national service would implant some backbone into our disaffected, bored, and often errant youth. So in the 1980s, I was a member of a small group of teachers campaigning for a general teaching council, a bit like the General Medical Council, where teachers could be registered and thus accountable. The leading light of this group was a Robert Bulchin, who became Sir Robert Bulchin, the Director General of the St John's Ambulance Brigade, and he's now Lord Lingfield. And he said to us once in the meeting that as late as the 1960s, he had bought a prep school in which the main curriculum was classics, Latin, Greek, and ancient history, and all the other subjects were incidental to it. I'm not saying that we should return to such a narrow curriculum, but on the other hand, this is a type of education that spawned the great leaders of the past. Why? Because in the classics, apart from the complexity of the language and the beauty of the literature, one meets great men, fantastic orators, big ideas, enlightened administration, fine examples, and proud empires. I'm not saying that our empire was an out-and-out good thing, containing as it did its injustices, but we should at least be able to manage affairs in our own country. So what can we do about this backward trend? Perhaps we can take our cue from Diogenes again and retrace our steps. When he visited the 111th Olympic Games, he said, "I come to combat anger, mistrust, sadness, desire, and fear, the evils, the ills of mankind." If we change those to the opposites, so the opposite of anger is love. Mistrust is just the sense of otherness from our fellow beings. And if we substitute that with friendliness, friendship, then otherness seems to disappear. With sadness, I'm struck by the recent successful politicians, Giorgia Meloni of Italy and Javier Milei of Argentina, who always seem to be laughing and smiling. Perhaps we should not take ourselves so seriously and make light of things a bit more. Desires. How many great men, otherwise great men, have been pulled down by their desires? If we change that to self-sacrifice, then we're putting others before ourselves. And fear. Fear has, how many sort of wrongs and ills have been allowed to continue because of fear of litigation. So perhaps we could substitute that with courage, boldness to do the right thing. So there's a tip from Diogenes, which we can put into action today, perhaps. If you've enjoyed this, then like it and share it, and join us for another Philosophy Live next week. Farewell.